the ecosystem in India today currently has various players. One set of players is focused on philanthropy. The other set of players is focused on what is known as impact investment. And there are other players who are for-profit players but incidentally also create impact. You've now been through the journey as a CSR consulting firm for 10 years. And the first 5 years there was no law that really actually mandated corporates to apportion a certain percentage of their profits for CSR initiatives. The next 5 years we've actually seen it. I think we'll start with some basics. Was there a requirement for law to mandate CSR to be undertaken by companies? Did companies need to be told by law that this is something you need to do? And how has actually, having seen the last 5 years, how has the law shaped corporate behavior in this country? As a consultant, you're at a vantage point in actually seeing how corporates have reacted to this legislation. So it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. So I think, so there was a lot of philanthropic capital over the last 20-30 years that came into India, but came through aid agencies. Right? So, and those obviously came from businesses, from those countries which were paying taxes, which eventually became aid money for other countries to kind of work on. But the money getting generated through business got channeled through different sources into countries that needed, capital from a philanthropic point of view. I think the shift that India was kind of beginning to make was we were more. We very clearly became a fast-growing economy, over the last 20 years. We probably have the fastest growing number of millionaires and billionaires, as an ecosystem. So with all of that, and obviously the corporate sector and the markets booming, the money that was kind of actually generated from the businesses here, but probably more relevant, for that to be kind of used, in the Indian context. Again, from a development point of view, because the inequality still remains, and it remains in different parts of the world. So I think the law was, I believe, a very, very good enabler in getting the corporates into the dialogue of development and nation building, because I think it's important for the markets. And if I take a very pure market point of view, a better Jharkhand or a better Chhattisgarh is good for everybody, and I think investing in development of a UP, Bihar, or a Northeast, or parts of Karnataka which are still, kind of being left behind, I think is good market, right? And so even from a fundamental principle of market, I think it makes a lot of sense for some part of corporate resources. It could be knowledge, it could be money, it could be expertise to actually be poured into development, of the nation and the ecosystem. And I think that the fact that the law enabled it, I think was great. I believe it's not like that nobody was doing it. Obviously people were doing it, and there are some great examples of how CSR was done before the law. I think the law actually learned from those examples to actually, kind of create the law. But has the law actually accelerated the participation of corporate? Yes, for sure, right? I think there's no question about it. So I think the law was, was an interesting add to the mix. I don't think I would go to the extent of saying it is a must to have the law, but I think it kind of gave a nice, twist to the story in terms of how more the corporate could participate and opening up the imagination of the corporate. I think what it also did was till then a lot of the CSR was anecdotal and not measured very deeply. People would talk about it, tell you stories about what they're doing, but today it's much more measurable. We know exactly where the monies are going, how much money is going, which kind of sectors it's going, how is it complementing with some of the government policies. So all of that data is now, that much better participation and partnerships have started to emerge because there's more data, it's more structured. So I think the law in that sense has done its job. In terms of the reaction, we ourselves were actually very, I would say, to start off, very cynical about the law. We actually were so deeply in the impact space with all the philanthropic and the non-profit ecosystem that we said, I think the future of business being sustainable and shared value is probably the right direction for business to go to, rather than a 2% share of profit. But I think obviously that's a much longer journey for corporates to make in terms of the shared value part of it. But when we were actually also slow in reacting to the law, because again, I think we were sitting in Bangalore where not so much of conversation actually happened. Most of it happened in Bombay and Delhi. But what I learned when I went out and met a lot of the corporates and CSR heads was that everybody had the right intent and now they had the resources, to kind of do it. And the fact that this was made a board mandate made us such a big difference, because it now was seen as a function which had a lot more responsibility in many ways. And I think that made it a big shift. And today we see most of the progressive corporates evolving very, very strongly. We are, at least personally, I'm in at least 8 to 10 conversations right now where boards of organizations are talking about redefining the CSR program, and this I'm saying in the last 3 months. So that's the level of thinking. So people are not just writing checks; they're saying, how do I create CSR to be a strategic advantage for my company, and how do I also create impact with it? Right? I mean, I think that's today a good conversation to have. Still a long way to go, but I would say it's the reaction and the start has been in the right direction.
So you do believe, obviously, that the law has played a positive enabling role in that sense. You've done some interesting analysis on where CSR funds have been deployed within India, and I think one of the findings of your research was that there are certain regions that have not been the beneficiaries of CSR funds. For example, I think the Northeast is still a disadvantaged region. Would it make a difference if the CSR provisions are amended to remove the requirement to spend CSR funds in the local area of operation of the company? And would that then possibly address the regional imbalance?
I would definitely think so. I think that would be a great start. I think today law already gives you enough opportunity to go beyond. I mean, it's just a suggestion, or it's not super prescriptive to say you have to. Even the local region is not very clearly defined. I mean, you could draw the boundaries as you go. I think what we are realizing, in addition to that, let's say that shift in the law, I think the conversation around data on exactly where people are spending, how it's being spent, and what the impact is, itself is going to make a big difference. Because it was very interesting that when we published that report on where money is getting spent in India, and we showed pockets of districts or states where the money was not as spent, and we had the chance to present this in CSR forums, the reaction was, oh, I didn't know, to a large extent. And immediately, the conversation shifted to saying, what do I have to do to change in my current CSR policy to actually enable this? So I think awareness of this kind of spending, because I think everybody, the law also came, I would say, without too much of a preparation or a warning, right? It was, 2014, everybody had to kind of, suddenly comply. So a lot of the people did what was easier relatively, and also safer, because it was also a compliance issue. But I think now, after 3-4 years of the law, the dust has settled. Now people are thinking more strategically. And one of the things that I think they will do more strategically is to look at data and say, oh, there are parts of the country we are not spending as much money, or parts of issues we are not spending enough money on. It's not just a regional thing. Like something like heritage and art, being Indians, we don't spend enough money on that. Sports is a big issue, and people talk about it all the time. So sports is something that in India you don't spend enough money on from a CSR perspective. So it's not just a regional, but also an issue thing, and it's a matter of growing, I would say, where once all of us had to do it in the way that it was immediately sets the the base. Now that the base is set, I think now more interesting real stuff will start to happen, where people will start re-looking at their strategy, people will start rethinking about the right places to invest, the right tools to invest in stuff.
At the other end of the spectrum, recently we also heard the story about the Ministry of Corporate Affairs issuing notices to around 5,000 companies for not complying with the CSR law. What are your thoughts on how should companies be made to comply with the law? And is it time to move away from a name and shame approach, or is there any other way to make companies comply with the law?
So I think the good news about that number is that out of the 16,000 odd companies, 11,000 didn't get notices, right? Which means there are a lot more people now doing. And if you look at the data that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has been sharing, the reporting of CSR, data has actually grown every year. There was only I think 6 or 8,000 crores reported a few years ago. Now it's reaching close to 14 odd crores. 14,000 odd crores. I think that's a big shift, which is positive. So I think it's a matter of again growing up. I think there are certain companies. We also have to figure out whether those 5,000 companies, some are struggling with certain issues. To what is the reason for non-compliance? I think it's not fair to assume they don't want to do kind of CSR. I am personally not a big kind of fan of name and shame kind of an approach. I think there has to be distinct corporate advantage that has to be seen, which I think companies are beginning to see, especially in BFSI, manufacturing, and many other kind of sectors where it weaves in extremely well with the overall business strategy. And like I said, a good developed India is good for business for everybody. Whoever kind of plays a part in actually doing that, obviously, business, advantage can be there. So I think a better model would be to get, corporates to talk to corporates and more peer, conversations rather than just a push down from the top. And again, more data to be shared on really showcasing how this is actually helping everybody. Because it is helping everybody. I mean, we see it on a day-to-day basis on how this is helping the employee base, how it's helping the brand of the organization, how it's even helping the way the conversation happens in the leadership and the board, on certain issues. So talent development, leadership development, social, sector can actually bring in so much to the corporate sector as well. So I think from that perspective, I would probably focus more on the incentives rather than a more stricter law. But again, I'm not an expert on that particular topic.